On March 9, 1974, on the island of Lubang in the Philippines, a man emerges from the dense jungle wearing the tattered uniform of the Imperial Japanese Army. He is 52 years old. In his hands, he holds an Arisaka Type 99 rifle, which still works perfectly. At his side, he carries a samurai sword, gleaming despite decades of wear. On his belt, he has 500 rounds of ammunition and several hand grenades. This man's name is Hiroo Onoda, and for the last 29 years, almost 3 decades, he believed that World War II was still ongoing. When Onoda hands over his sword to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, the whole world watches in disbelief. How could it be that a soldier fought for nearly 30 years after the war had ended? How did he survive alone in the jungle for the last 2 years? And why did he refuse to surrender, despite dozens of attempts to convince him that the war was over? This is the story of a man who became a national hero in Japan, but a murderer in the Philippines. A story of loyalty that crossed the line into obsession. A story that raises the question, where does duty end and crime begin? Today, we tell the true story of Hiroo Onoda, the last soldier of World War II. On March 19, 1922, in the village of Kamikawa in Wakayama Prefecture, western Japan, Hiroo Onoda was born. He was the 4th of 7 children in a family with samurai roots. His father, Tanejiro, was a teacher and a member of the Wakayama Prefectural Assembly, a strict traditional Japanese man. His mother, Tamai, came from a renowned samurai family and was the first female teacher in her town. She raised her children with strict discipline and a deep sense of service to the emperor. Hiroo was a rebellious boy, completely different from his older brothers, who excelled in school. He was only 17 years old when he ran away from home in 1939. He didn't want to listen to his father. He went to Wuhan, China, where he worked for the Tajima Yoko Trading Company. It was there that his older brother, who served in the army, found him. In 1942, at the age of 20, Hiroo was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army. He quickly stood out and was selected for elite intelligence training. He was assigned to the Futamata unit of the famous Nakano School in Tokyo, a secret academy that trained officers in intelligence and guerrilla warfare. They taught not only combat but also philosophy, history, martial arts, propaganda, and covert operations. Most importantly, the training at Nakano contradicted the official Senjin-kun code, which instructed soldiers to die rather than surrender. Nakano instructors said the exact opposite: survive at any cost. On December 26, 1944, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda received an order that would change his life forever. He was sent to the small island of Lubang in the Philippines, located 150 kilometers southwest of Manila. His mission was clear: carry out guerrilla operations, destroy the airstrip and dock in the port before the anticipated Allied invasion, and destroy any enemy aircraft or boats trying to land. His direct superior, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, gave him orders that Onoda would never forget. Taniguchi said, "I strictly forbid you to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we will come back for you. As long as you have even one soldier with you, you must lead him." It was a promise, but it was also a trap. When Onoda arrived on Lubang, he immediately encountered a problem. The senior officers already stationed on the island outranked him. They refused to allow him to destroy the airstrip and port, arguing that they needed the infrastructure for the evacuation of their own people before the Americans arrived. Onoda felt disappointed and humiliated. He did not carry out the order before it was too late. On February 28, 1945, American and Filipino forces attacked Lubang. Within a few days, they had taken control of the island. Most of the Japanese soldiers either died, surrendered, or escaped by boat. Onoda and just 3 other soldiers retreated into the mountains of the island. These men were Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka. 4 men against the world. During the first months after the invasion, The 4 Japanese soldiers survived on wild bananas and coconuts and by stealing rice from local farmers. They avoided American and Filipino patrols. They were convinced their army would return and retake the island. They only had to survive long enough. In August 1945, Japan surrendered after the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The news even reached Lubang. American planes dropped leaflets announcing Emperor Hirohito's surrender. But Onoda and his men did not believe it for a moment. They studied the leaflets for hours, looking for mistakes. They found plenty, or so they thought. The dates seemed odd. The seals didn't look authentic. The language was too simple. Onoda was convinced. It was Allied propaganda, a classic psychological trick to force Japanese soldiers out of hiding. At the end of 1945, more leaflets were dropped. This time they included a surrender order signed by General Tomoyuki Yamashita of the 14th Area Army. Onoda analyzed the document with obsessive care. After a long discussion with his comrades, he decided this was a forgery too. Too many details didn't match. His Nakano training had taught him mistrust. Now that mistrust had become his prison. In February 1952, letters from soldiers' families were dropped along with photographs. Onoda saw his family after years. The town in the photos looked different from how he remembered it. Taller buildings, different roads. For Onoda, this was proof, a photo montage, another trap. He could not believe the world could have changed so much without him. In September 1949, something changed in the group. Private Yuichi Akatsu, the youngest of them, began to have doubts. During one night patrol, he simply broke away from the group and vanished into the dark. Onoda and the other 2 were shocked, but also suspicious. Maybe it was a trick? Maybe Akatsu meant to lead them into an ambush. Akatsu wandered alone for 6 months. In March 1950, he emerged from the jungle and surrendered to Filipino forces. To Onoda, this was the worst possible betrayal. When they heard that Akatsu had surrendered, they did not take it as a sign that the war was truly over. On the contrary, they became even more cautious. Now they knew one of them had cracked under pressure, so the enemy would be even more determined to find them. From that moment, there were 3 of them: Onoda, Shimada, and Kozuka. They tightened their bonds and grew even more disciplined in their actions. They perfected survival techniques. They built a series of hidden shelters across the island. They learned to recognize every sound of the jungle, every smell. They knew where they could safely steal rice, where water sources were, and where patrols visited least often. Now their goal was no longer only survival. Onoda believed they had to actively continue the mission. That meant sabotage, gathering intelligence on enemy movements, and, as he called it, guerrilla operations. But for the people of Lubang, those operations meant something else. An era of terror was beginning, one that would last another 2 decades. Over the following years, Onoda and his comrades developed an elaborate survival system. They built huts called bahai, from branches and coconut leaves. Onoda later said they could erect such a shelter in 7 to 8 hours. They strengthened the structure with vines rather than rope. The shelter had 2 parts, an upper sleeping area and a lower section for cooking. The hearth consisted of 2 stacks of flat stones between which they lit a fire, with a metal pot, found on an abandoned farm, suspended above it. They obtained food in various ways. The diet's staples were wild bananas and coconuts, but that was not enough. They regularly stole rice from farms. Their greatest treat, however, was beef. When a cow wandered away from a village, they waited until evening, preferably during rain, which muffled the sound, and shot the animal with their rifle. They had 1 hour to butcher the carcass before anyone might hear them. Fresh meat was eaten for 3 days, the rest dried on special racks. One cow yielded about 250 pieces of dried beef. Each of them usually ate only 1 piece a day. Onoda discovered that after eating meat, his body temperature rose, so he drank coconut milk to lower it. They never lit fires during the day. Smoke could give them away. Onoda later said, "For all 30 years on Lubang, I never once slept through the whole night." He was always on guard, always listening. Water was never a problem. Streams were everywhere and so clear they could see the bottom. They used wire, cans, and other materials to make traps for rats and small game. They kept their military equipment in perfect condition. Rifles were cleaned regularly, uniforms patched, ammunition carefully stored in dry places. In June 1953, Corporal Shoichi Shimada was shot in the leg during a surprise skirmish with local fishermen. The bullet hit him in the thigh, and the wound was deep, quickly becoming infected. Onoda took it upon himself to care for Shimada, using whatever he had: clean water, sticks to immobilize the leg, and pieces of his uniform as bandages. It was a desperate fight for his comrade's life. Shimada survived, but his recovery took months. He limped for the rest of his life. On May 7, 1954, less than a year after being wounded, Shimada was. That day, he and Onoda accidentally encountered a Filipino mountain unit conducting training exercises on the island. There was no time to flee. A gunfight broke out. Shimada was struck by the first salvo instantly. Onoda barely escaped with his life, retreating into the dense foliage. After Shimada's death, there were only two left, Onoda and Kozuka. For Onoda, this was the second great loss and another proof that the war was still ongoing. If the war had ended, why were Filipino forces still shooting at them? In his mind, the logic was simple. The fight continued, so he had to continue the mission. Shimada's death only reinforced his determination. Onoda and Kozuka grew even closer. They became like brothers. Onoda later wrote, "The 18 years I spent with Kozuka were the time when I was most active in guerrilla tactics. This was largely due to the understanding between us. We almost always saw things the same way, and often one look was enough to decide what we would do. They were a team, but their guerrilla tactics had casualties that Onoda preferred not to mention in his autobiography. What Onoda didn't like to talk about was the true cost of his 30-year mission. According to Philippine media and the testimonies of the residents of Lubang, Onoda and his comrades to 30 civilians during their years in hiding. These were not soldiers. They were farmers, fishermen, parents returning from the fields, innocent people who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. On March 8, 1951, Emilio Viana went out to tend his sweet potato field with his two sons, Protazio and Danny, both teenagers. After the morning work, Emilio sat down for a lunch break and drank coffee. Suddenly, rang out. The first bullet pierced his thigh, severing the main artery. The second hit young Danny in the leg. The sons rushed to help their father, trying to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. Emilio bled to death in front of his children. He was 42 years old. The next day would have been his birthday. This was only one case. Other residents spoke of similar attacks. People shot while working in the fields, harvesting rice or fishing. Onoda called it guerrilla operations and actions against enemy partisans. But these people were not partisans. They were civilians trying to survive in a post-war world. In his 1974 autobiography, No Surrender, My 30-Year War, Onoda hardly mentions these. He writes euphemistically about guerrilla tactics and skirmishes with the enemy, never using the word civilian. For the families of the victims, it was unacceptable. Their loved ones had been someone fighting in a war that had ended decades ago. In 1959, 14 years after the war ended, the Japanese government officially declared Hiroo Onoda and Kinshichi Kozuka dead. The families received certificates. Onoda's mother mourned the son she had lost at the age of 22. His brothers started their own families, believing Hiroo had died somewhere in the Philippine jungle. But life on Lubang went on. The Japanese authorities, still hopeful that Onoda was alive, made several attempts to contact him. They dropped newspapers, magazines, and letters from family members, Some of this material was indeed found by Onoda and Kozuka. They read articles about Japan in the 1950s and 1960s. They saw photos of rebuilt cities, tall buildings, cars filling the streets. They read about the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, about Japan's economic miracle. For Onoda, it was all unbelievable. This world they saw in the photos was too different, too modern. In his mind, it was all an elaborate enemy production. He had to admit, the Americans were masters at creating fake propaganda materials. But he wouldn't be fooled. He knew that true Japanese soldiers never surrender. His training in Nakano had been clear. Mistrust is your protection. Over the years, life on Lubang had become routine. Onoda and Kozuka knew every path, every tree, every hiding place on the island. The island's inhabitants lived in fear. They never knew when the spirits of the jungle would strike again. The Philippine police tried to track them down, but without success. The two were too good, too well trained, too determined, and too convinced that they were fighting a just cause. On October 19, 1972, Hiru Onoda and Kinshichi Kozuka carried out one of their regular operations, setting fire to piles of rice harvested by the villagers. This was their signal to the Japanese forces. "We are here, still fighting. Don't forget about us." After 27 years, it had become their ritual of hope. But this time, something went wrong. The Philippine police were alerted faster than usual. A gunfight ensued. Kozuka was hit multiple times and died on the spot. Onoda barely managed to escape. For the first time in almost 3 decades, he was completely alone. He was 50 years old, alone on the island with the enemy searching for him, with a mission he couldn't abandon, and with an order he had received 28 years earlier. "Do not surrender. Survive. We will come for you." Kozuka's death was a tremendous blow for Onoda. In his autobiography, he wrote, "The hardest part of this experience was losing my comrades." But even that didn't break his resolve. For the next 2 years, Onoda lived completely alone in the Lubang jungle. He conserved his ammunition. He had only about 500 rounds left. Every shot had to count. In those solitary years, Onoda became even more cautious. He left his hiding places less often. He ate less, moving only at night. But he still remained vigilant. He still waited. He still believed that his government would come for him. For the people of Lubang, the spirit of the jungle became almost a mythical figure, someone who survived for decades, whom no one could catch. Some began to doubt whether he truly existed. Onoda watched the world from a distance. Sometimes he heard helicopters, saw tourists on the beach in the distance, observed modern boats cruising along the shore. The world was changing, but he remained the same, a Japanese lieutenant on a mission whose end he had yet to see. At the beginning of 1974, 24-year-old Norio Suzuki was telling his friends about his plan to travel around the world. He said, "I'm looking for 3 things: Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and a yeti, in exactly that order." Most people thought it was just a joke from an eccentric student traveler, but Suzuki wasn't joking. On February 20th, he arrived in Lubang with a backpack, camera, and boundless enthusiasm. What happened next seems unbelievable. After just 4 days of searching, Suzuki found Onoda in the jungle. According to Onoda's account, this hippie boy came to the island to listen to the feelings of a Japanese soldier. Suzuki was young, full of energy, and genuinely fascinated by Onoda's story. He didn't treat him like a criminal or a madman. He treated him like a legend. For several days, Suzuki and Onoda talked in the jungle. Suzuki took photos as proof of their meeting. He tried to convince Onoda that the war had ended almost 30 years ago. He showed him newspapers, told him about modern Japan, the Olympics, and the economic boom. But Onoda politely listened and repeated the same thing. "I cannot surrender without a direct order from my commanding officer." Suzuki asked, "Who is your commanding officer?" Onoda answered, "Major Yoshimi Taniguchi of the 14th Area Army. If he comes and gives me an order, I will surrender. But only then. That was the condition. Suzuki nodded and promised to try to find Major Taniguchi and bring him to Lubang. Onoda didn't believe it was possible. It had been almost 30 years. The major was probably... But at least this young man was trying to understand. Suzuki returned to Japan with photos that shook the country. Hiru Onoda was alive. 15 years after being officially declared, he was still alive, still wearing his Imperial Army uniform. When Norio Suzuki returned to Japan with photos of Onoda, the country went into a frenzy. The media talked about nothing else. The Japanese government was faced with a dilemma: how to bring this man back. Suzuki presented Onoda's condition: only an order from Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. A frantic search began. Taniguchi would now be 63 years old, if he was even alive. Military records were searched, veterans were questioned, and archives were combed through. And finally, they found him. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi was alive. After the war, he had become a bookseller in a quiet suburb of Tokyo. He ran a small, modest bookstore. He lived an ordinary, quiet life, trying to forget the war. When government representatives arrived at his bookstore, Taniguchi could hardly believe it. Onoda? Alive? For 30 years? It seemed impossible. But when they showed him the photos taken by Suzuki, he recognized his former subordinate. The same intense gaze, the same posture. Taniguchi knew he had to go. For Taniguchi, it was a return to a past he had tried to bury. He remembered the young, eager lieutenant to whom he had given an order in December 1944. Never surrender. It might take 3 years, maybe 5, but we will come for you. Now, almost 30 years had passed, and he had to keep that promise. On March 9, 1974, Major Taniguchi, now an older man, flew to Lubang along with Suzuki and representatives of the Japanese government. They were about to have a meeting that would go down in history, a moment that would end the longest individual fight of World War II. Kozuka didn't live to see the end. On October 19, 1972, almost 30 years after Japan's surrender, the two soldiers encountered Filipino farmers while drying rice. Kozuka instinctively aimed his weapon. A shot from a Filipino policeman ended his mission. Hiru Onoda was left completely alone. He buried his friend with his own hands. For the next few days, he spoke to his grave. "Kozuka-san, what should I do now?" he asked in the silence of the jungle. There was no answer. For the first time since 1945, he was truly alone. No order had prepared him for this solitude. He was 50 years old. The world across the ocean was following the moon landing, listening to the Beatles, and ending the war in Vietnam. Meanwhile, he remained alone in the jungle on Lubang Island, still fighting a war that had ended 3 decades earlier. 2 years completely alone. Hiru Onoda, now a 50-year-old soldier, fought the loneliest war in history. Every bullet mattered twice as much. Every sound could be a trap. He conserved his remaining 500 rounds of ammunition like sacred relics of his mission. His caution reached a paranoid level. He changed positions every few hours. He never slept in the same place twice. The Filipinos in the village of Luke began telling their children terrifying stories about the ghosts in the mountains, the Japanese soldier ghost who never... The mountains of Lubang became a forbidden zone. No one went there. No one dared. And Onoda? He just followed orders. Day after day, night after night. He waited for something he couldn't even name. Maybe for a miracle. Maybe for death. Maybe for the order to end his mission, which never came. And then Norio Suzuki appeared. A 23-year-old Japanese student traveler, a classic 70s hippie who told his friends, "I'm looking for 3 things: Lieutenant Onoda, a giant panda, and a yeti," in exactly that order. It sounded like a crazy joke. But Suzuki wasn't joking. In February 1974, he arrived in Lubang with a backpack, a camera, and unwavering faith. Filipinos thought he was insane. "No one goes there," they warned. "There's the ghost of war." On February 20th, 1974, after 4 days of wandering through the Forbidden Mountains, Suzuki found him. Onoda was sitting by a fire, his uniform in tatters, his rifle leaning against a tree. 50 years old, but his eyes were those of an old man. "I'm Japanese," Suzuki said. Onoda aimed his rifle. After a moment, he lowered it. "This hippie boy," Onoda would later recall, "just came to listen to the feelings of a Japanese soldier." They talked all night. Suzuki took photos, proof that the legend was still alive. Suzuki begged him, "Please come home. The war is over." But Onoda shook his head. "I can't." "Not without an order from my commanding officer. Major Taniguchi is the only one who can release me from my duties," Onoda explained calmly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I will only surrender if he gives the order to end my mission." Suzuki understood. He returned to Japan with photos that shook the nation. After almost 30 years of silence, proof of life. The Japanese authorities began a frantic search. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, Onoda's commander from 1944, was now a bookseller. He sold books in a small shop in Tokyo. When they went to him, at first he didn't believe it. Onoda? Alive? He felt an overwhelming burden. He was the one who had sent this man on this cursed mission. He was the one who had condemned him to 30 years of hell. Now only he could end it. Taniguchi pulled out his old uniform from the closet. He remembered the orders, and he agreed to fly to Lubang. March 9, 1974. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, now a civilian in a borrowed uniform, entered the Lubang jungle. Onoda recognized him immediately. He stood at attention. After 29 years, 7 months, and 23 days, he saluted his commander. Taniguchi straightened up. His voice trembled, but his words were clear. According to Imperial Order Number 2180, the 14th Area Army has ended all combat operations. You are officially relieved of duty. Your mission is over. Hiroo Onoda, a soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army, a 50-year-old man who had survived 10,416 days in a war that had ended decades ago, broke down. He cried like a small child. For 30 years he had clung to iron discipline. Now it all crumbled. With trembling hands, he handed over his equipment to his commander. A samurai sword, an Arisaka Type 99 rifle, 500 carefully preserved rounds of ammunition, hand grenades, and a dagger, the same one his mother had given him before he left for war. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "that it took so long." March 10, 1974. At the Philippine radar base, Onoda officially signed his capitulation. The next day, March 11th, a grand ceremony took place at the Malacañang Palace in Manila. President Ferdinand Marcos personally granted him a pardon. No charges, no punishment. But the Filipinos were furious. A pardon? For what? For killing 30 of our people? The families of the victims demanded compensation. They wanted justice. Instead, they got ceremonial handshakes and photos with a smiling Marcos. In Japan, the situation was equally bizarre. Onoda had been officially declared dead in 1959. His family had received a funeral allowance. And now? Suddenly, he was alive. The bureaucracy went crazy. The death certificate had to be revoked, citizenship reinstated, and the tax issues from the past 30 years had to be sorted out. But for millions of Japanese people, the details didn't matter. Onoda was alive. He was coming home, still in his old tattered imperial uniform, a symbol of something Japan had lost or had tried to rid itself of. No one was quite sure. Tokyo, March 1974. An 8,000-strong crowd waited at the airport. When Hiroo Onoda stepped off the plane, still in that same tattered uniform, the cheers erupted. "Hero! Hero!" they chanted. Japan had received a living legend. He became a national symbol, the embodiment of loyalty, duty, and the samurai spirit in the modern world. Television stations broadcasted him non-stop. Newspapers wrote articles. Publishers fought for his memoirs. In 1974, he published a best-selling book, No Surrender, My 30-Year War. It sold millions of copies. He described the jungle, his loneliness, his loyalty to the emperor, and his determination. But there was one problem. The book barely mentioned the civilians he. The 30 Filipino victims were reduced to a few sentences. They were enemies, he explained. I was following orders. For the Japanese, thirsty for heroes, that was enough. For Filipinos, it was an insult, a wound that would never heal. However, Hiroo Onoda couldn't live in modern Japan. Everything was too loud, too fast, too soft. People complained about trivial things. No one understood the concepts of mission, sacrifice, or honor. In April 1975, just a year after his return, he packed his bags and left for Brazil. He bought a farm in Mato Grosso do Sul. There, in the wilderness, he raised cattle, far from civilization. He met Machie, a teacher of traditional Japanese tea ceremonies. They married. She understood old-fashioned honor. But Japan didn't let him go entirely. In 1984, he returned. He founded the Onoda Nature School, a survival camp for Japanese youth. I will teach them discipline, he said, the discipline that this country no longer has. In 1996, something remarkable happened. Onoda returned to Lubang for the first time since his surrender. The locals took to the streets in protest. They remembered. The families of the victims remembered. But Onoda came with a gesture. He established a scholarship fund, $10,000 for the local school. It won't atone for the death, the families of the victims said, but they accepted it. Because what else could they do? January 16, 2014. Hiroo Onoda passed away in Tokyo at the age of 91. His funeral was a state event. Thousands of people, military honors, the Japanese flag. In Japan, he remained a hero until the end, a symbol of traditional samurai values, loyalty, discipline, and indomitable will. The last true warrior, the newspapers wrote. In the Philippines, for many, he remained a terrorist. 30 innocent people. A hero? Asked Filipino veterans. He's a murderer who ran from justice. His story continues to unsettle. In 2021, the film Onoda, 10,000 Nights in the Jungle was released. In 2022, Werner Herzog wrote a novel about him. Documentarians, historians, and filmmakers still return to the same question.